who, Jesus asks, would start to build a tower without first sitting down to see if he had enough money to finish? Okay, besides the Mady Corporation, who else would start to build a tower without seeing if there was enough money to finish? Jesus was not in the business of giving advice about the construction industry, but he was in the business of asking searching questions. And he asked that his followers, the day that was recorded in the book of Luke chapter 14, consider the question, who would set out on something big and important without thinking it through beforehand? Jesus calls us to be his followers, and he makes no illusion about the fact that that is a really big request. It's not something to be taken lightly. And so we ask those of us who are thinking about being his followers to think it through, to imagine what might be the implications so that we're prepared, and that when adversity comes, we will be able to follow through on the commitments and the promises that we have made. I'd like to spend a few minutes with you this morning thinking about this call to follow Jesus. On the one hand, as it comes to us collectively, as a church community, and as it comes to us also as individuals. And since this is the climax of our Stewardship Focus Month, I'd like to make some reference to this challenge as we think together about our money. So first off, the call of Jesus comes to us as a people. Jesus challenged the audience in his day, saying, who would start to build a tower without having first sat down to see if there was enough money to finish the project? Some scholars think that Jesus may have been alluding to the temple in Jerusalem. You see, the original temple built by King Solomon had been destroyed by the Babylonians in ancient history. And in the time of Jesus, the temple of Jerusalem was being reconstructed. It was a project of Herod the Great to make it the biggest and grandest building in all the world. In the time of Jesus, the building had been under construction for over 50 years and was still not completed. In any case, Jesus was calling his followers to set out on nothing less than the change and transformation of the world in the name of God's kingdom. And he asked them to set out in risk and in trust to follow where he would lead. But he warned them, don't do so haphazardly. Don't do so without thought. That would be foolish. Rather, we can take the implication of what he said to understand that as we embark on following him together, we ought to think carefully, we ought to pray diligently, and to plan wisely. This past few Sundays, and coming to conclusion today, we have been asked to think together a little bit about what the year ahead will bring for Collier Street United Church. And one of the ways that we think about that together is by considering the submission of an estimate of giving, what we think we might be able to give in the year ahead. It's not a pledge, it's not a guilt trip of any kind, it's an estimate, which is provided by each of us in confidence. Together, these will be added up to provide a picture of what it is we can do together as a congregation in 2016. Jesus calls us to follow not just as individuals, but together. And one way we can put this question or challenge to ourselves is this: what, with God's help, can we do together? A couple of years ago, I was watching a documentary on TV, and it was a profile of the courier company, FedEx. I have to tell you, it was one of the most interesting programs I have ever seen. They gave an incredibly in-depth look at the way that organization runs, and it is mind-boggling not only in its complexity, but also in its efficiency and its success. They have offices all over the world, and every year they ship millions and millions of packages from point A to point B at little dots all over the world, and they do so with such an incredible speed and at a relatively low cost to the customer. Many years ago, I was a university student attending Campbell University in rural North Carolina. And as I was coming to the conclusion of my studies, I had decided that I was going to apply for graduate school closer to home at the University of Toronto. And so I had spent a few weeks preparing my application and all the materials that needed to accompany it. And the very last thing I was waiting for was a letter of recommendation from one of my professors. And one afternoon, he gave me a call and said that it was ready, and I went over and picked it up and compiled it together with all of the other things I needed to submit, and went over the checklist and made sure I have everything. And it was about 4:30 in the afternoon. Now, I lived about 10 miles away from the nearest large town. And so at 4:30, I hopped in the car and drove the 10 miles to Dunn, North Carolina. If you've ever driven down I-95, you will see the exit for Dunn. And I went into the local FedEx, and I handed my package over the counter and paid for it and got my receipt, and it was about 10 to 5 in the afternoon. Well, over the course of the evening, I kept my receipt handy with the tracking number for my package and watched as it was in transit. And wouldn't you believe if my application didn't arrive at the Office of Missions of the Toronto School of Theology at Queen's Park Crescent in Toronto about 9 o'clock the next morning? I could hardly have driven my application there any faster in real time that it arrived, even though it was being shipped with all kinds of other packages from all over the place. Of course, a company like FedEx, they have computer systems, and they have technology, they have buses and airplanes and all kinds of things. But at the very root of such a complex and successful organization is human beings. Many thousands of people contributing their time and their ingenuity and their resources combine together to produce a kind of operation which we could scarcely imagine alone. We human beings, when we pool our resources and our efforts together, are capable of truly remarkable things. A local church like ours, of course, operates on a much different scale from a multinational corporation. Out of necessity, a local church is made up of people who live in relatively close proximity to one another within a same community. In contrast to a business, we are not out to compete with other churches. We work in cooperation with the dozens of other churches in our city and in our area. And yet, we here in this congregation achieve wonderful things. We make a difference in people's lives. We bring one another into closer connection with the love of God. We share it in humble and simple ways with those beyond our walls. All kinds of wonderful things are done by this group of people together in the name of Jesus. And as we hope and dream and plan for the future, even more can yet be done. What, with God's help, can we do together? The call of Jesus to follow comes also to us as individuals, doesn't it? Jesus calls each of us to follow him. But he issues a warning of a kind. He says it will not be easy. There will be costs that we have to pay, things that we have to lay aside. If we're going to put God in first place, something else which we truly love must be put into second place. Over the last few weeks, we have been invited to consider as individuals and as families and households if we will offer an estimate of our giving for 2016 to the church office, and so that these can be pooled together, and those who put together our church budget can have some kind of accurate picture of what can be projected, both as income and then therefore as spending for the year ahead. But as we do that, something else happens. In the process, we must therefore consider, what will I or what will we give? We might phrase that question, if we can do great things together, what, with God's help as individuals and families, will we give up in order to make that happen? This past summer, there was a very well-known Christian writer and speaker named Elizabeth Elliot who died. And I heard a talk of hers over the radio from many years ago, in which she was addressing a group of college students. And she was telling them a story about how many, many years ago, I think it was perhaps the late 1940s, when she was a student, that she was very much in love with one of her classmates, who in turn was very much in love with her. And they wanted to get married very badly. But they were people of deep faith, and they decided that they ought to commit their relationship and all of their lives to God's will through prayer. And they came to discern together over a period of time that God did not wish for them to get married, at least not at that time. And so they made the decision, which must have been incredibly difficult and painful, to set aside their relationship to pursue God's calling on their individual lives. Now, thankfully, by the grace of God, she says it was a few years later when they were able to be reunited and recommitted their relationship to prayer, and discerned at that time that God would be happy for them to get married, and they went on to have a very happy union together. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor and theologian from the last century, is perhaps the most famous writer in our time who has addressed for us the question of giving things up to follow Jesus. Bonhoeffer lived through the experience of Nazi Germany, and in his opposition to the Nazis, gave up a great deal in his life in Germany. Then he was afforded the opportunity to have really a cushy university teaching job in New York City, which he would very much like to have had. But he gave that up to go back and be united with his own people in their struggle against that evil and that tyranny. And eventually he laid down his life for that cause. And one of his most famous books, perhaps his most famous, is called in English, The Cost of Discipleship. And in that book, he contrasts what he calls cheap grace with what he calls costly grace. Cheap grace, he says, is grace as an abstract principle. The love of God as a concept, which has perhaps only indirect bearing on our everyday lives. Costly grace, he says, on the other hand, is the grace of God which moves us to a response. The grace of God which moves in our hearts in such a way that we are stirred to lay things aside and to be willing, if called upon, even to lay down our lives to follow Jesus for the sake of God's kingdom which he proclaimed. This, said Bonhoeffer, is true following of Jesus and the true grace of God. The famous Greek philosopher Socrates said famously, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Jesus has called us to follow him, but not to do so blindly. He calls us to follow, and in that, to examine our lives. I suggest that in these moments and going forward, we can think about this call to follow collectively as a community of faith and also as individual followers. And then I think the question of whether or not we will follow him can be broken down into two very specific questions. What, with God's help, can we do together? What, with God's help, as individuals and families, will we give to make that happen? Friends, may we live prayerfully examined lives that will be truly worth living, not just for ourselves, but for our world and for God. Amen.